Most, if not all of you, will be familiar with the Burney relief. If you haven't seen my video on the subject, you should go and see it. But here's a quick recap. We don't know exactly when it comes from. We don't know who it depicts. The item was sold to Burney, but comes from an unknown location, and this iconography is not found on Mesopotamian figures that do come from known locations. Experts have wisely chosen to simply call this image Queen of the Night and have it left unidentified. It is true that experts have weighed in on the subject, and there are a number of identifications out there, but these experts are generally quick to point out that such identifications are on shaky ground. In my prior video on the subject, I went through the major Mesopotamian possibilities. These are still the main contenders, but they also still have problems. Briefly, let's recap those strengths and weaknesses. The argument for the identification of this image as Inanna or Ishtar rests on the presence of the lions and the prominence of Inanna as a major goddess across all of Mesopotamia in general. The issues here are the nudity, as Inanna is not nude in any identified ancient image, the lack of any weapons, as weapons are almost always seen in association with her, and while lions are certainly associated with Inanna, they are not exclusive to her across the region, and none of the similar unprovenanced images have lions. In fact, many have the nude figure standing atop other animals entirely. Finally, there's the lack of any other iconographic features or symbols that would identify the figure as Inanna. When considering a Reshkigal, the strength is that it resembles what one would expect a modern image to look like given the textual descriptions. It has claws, it is nude, the feathered garment could be similar to a cloak of feathers that in turn might be associated with a Reshkigal. The bird-like legs and feathered cloak are presumed by some sources as being associated with the underworld. This identification, like that of Inanna, has major flaws. We don't have visual images to compare to. Color reconstructions show a reddish figure and not a pale skin, which one would expect a Reshkigal to have based on the way she is described in text, being as pale as tamarisk. Most damning of all, there are no identified images of a Reshkigal. Why would we see no items from known locations and several items from an unknown location or locations? The identification of Lilith is right out, of course, unless it's a modern forgery, which doesn't seem likely at this point. Identification as Ninlil isn't based on the Burney relief, but rather on a different piece of art with similar iconography to one of Ninlil's myths. I've been looking into information on this image for years now, and the more I consider it, the less I think that it is Inanna. For reference, here's a picture of Inanna. Note Inanna is not nude. She shows a single human foot and is not perched on a lion despite the presence of the lion. She has weapons on her back. In other words, Inanna's iconography is completely different. Given how consistent certain elements were in Inanna's iconography, it would be very strange if the pattern was deviated from completely. You might see a partial deviation, or some elements that are familiar to Inanna, but a complete deviation seems strange. The Burney relief is frequently identified as Inanna by amateurs based on its similarity with other images that look like it, which are identified as Inanna based on their similarity to the Burney relief. The great thing about circular logic is that it supports itself. Unfortunately, it doesn't really hold up for our purposes. We've talked about the major Mesopotamian possibilities, but there is another possibility, one glaring omission in all of this. What if the piece isn't even Mesopotamian? Do you remember when we covered the goddess Shala? She had the same pose as this image, but when looking at Shala, the pose is used to depict non-Mesopotamian deities, specifically Levantine deities. Here are two images of Shala, one from Mesopotamia and one from Syria. The Mesopotamians had a specific way they pointed out goddesses from the Levant. This shoots down Inanna, Ereshkigal, Ninlil, and any other of the major contenders in one fell swoop. Why would the Mesopotamians depict any of those deities as coming from a foreign land? Now let's take a look at a few of these unidentified images. Images that are attributed to Mesopotamia. This first one has something on her back that might be feathers, but that doesn't really give us enough to identify her. She is nude, has a horned helm of godhood, and is in the familiar pose. But unfortunately, this doesn't really give us any major iconography to go off of. Here's another image from an unknown source with a female figure surrounded by creatures associated with the water. Inanna isn't a goddess of the water. She's powerful and is a goddess of many things, but not that. It is reminiscent of a scene where Ninlil descends to the underworld, but Ninlil herself isn't really associated with water. There is a ram in this image, though. Remember that for later. This next one is also wearing the horned helm. She is nude except for what may be a cloak on her back. Questionably, she might have bird feet in this image, but this has not been an identifying feature of this sort of image. What is more important here is that the animals she is standing upon are not lions. Remember that the lions in the Burney relief were the chief indicator that the image could be identified as Inanna or Ishtar. This pair of animals hints that animals might be important, but that the specific form of the animal might not matter in the slightest. This one, again, doesn't show the details that one might expect of an Inanna image. We see no lions. We see no weapons. There are no symbols around her that tell us who we are looking at. She is nude, as we see in Levantine images, and she is cupping her breasts, as we see from some of those Levantine images. None of these things points to a specific Mesopotamian deity, but they do point away from Mesopotamia entirely. Let's remind ourselves what an Inanna image should look like. She has weapons. She has clothing. The Levantine goddess pose is missing. There are clearly wings and not a cloak. The lion style is different. There is a star of Utu above her shoulder. The only similarity between this and the Burney relief is the lion. But if the lion in the Burney relief is not a key element, this image then has no real resemblance to Inanna or Ishtar whatsoever. Here's another of her. Again, we see the lion. In fact, she is standing on two lions, but her feet show no signs of any avian features. Again, she is clothed and not in the distinctive Levantine pose. This terracotta plaque comes from the Yale Babylonian collection, if you can't read the label. Here we see the goddess depicted on the Ada seal. This is from a somewhat unknown source, although we don't know quite where it came from for certain. It was sourced from around Sippar. Given the sheaf of grain in her hand, what might be shoots growing from behind her wings, and her lack of Inanna iconic weapons, it likely depicts some deity other than Inanna. But for our purposes, that's not important. What is important is that the goddess is not nude and not in that familiar pose. Here are a few images of Levantine goddesses. Each of them has the same pose we have come to see in the unknown images. For the first time, it looks like we have a set of images where the Burney relief really belongs. There are clear variations from image to image, but the overall style seems to be consistent. You could imagine that each of these images shared a home culture. So the Burney relief image is possibly a Levantine image. It could also have been a Levantine goddess brought to Mesopotamia and given Mesopotamian iconography. In either case, it would have been seen as a foreign goddess to the Mesopotamian peoples prior to her adoption. This absolutely does not fit Inanna, and it could only fit Ereshkigal if the Mesopotamians wanted to depict her as the Lady of the Great Mountain as Kur could also mean mountain, and the Great Mountain could mean a foreign land. Now, here is Katesh, at least are often identified as Katesh. And with this, suddenly we have the iconography we were looking for. She's standing on a lion. She is in the right pose. She is nude. In her hands are distinctive symbols, which to me look like snakes and flowers. There is a symbol of godhood on her head. To the side are two Egyptian deities. We see these images from many time periods and across the region, including this one and a few others from Egypt. Here's a plaque identified as Katesh. Lion, object in hand which might be snakes and flowers, nude with arms up to the side, symbol of divinity over her head. Essentially, the iconography is identical to the image we just saw. They might be different objects from the rod and the ring, and the symbol of her godhood over her head is Egyptian, but in essence they serve as the symbols of office, which the horned helm and the rod and the ring also do. In that respect, it is identical to the Burney relief, except for the fact that we have one lion here instead of two. And yet another one. This time, the figure is standing on crocodiles. The ram from before is in her right hand, and the lion from before is in her left. She is holding the ram's horns and the tails of the two scorpions in her right hand. In her left contains a lion and several snakes. We're seeing the same animals over and over, lions, rams, and snakes in particular. You could argue that the goddess is not Katesh, but rather a different Levantine goddess, such as Anat or Asherah. You could even make a much weaker argument that these all might be an Egyptian deity, but Inanna at this point seems right out. There are some clearly Mesopotamian elements in the Queen of the Night image. The horned helm is of Mesopotamian origin, but we see the horned helm on this figure standing to the left of Baal from a seal found in Syria. The rod and the ring are also Mesopotamian, but we know for a fact that cultures outside of the Levant were fine with borrowing symbols from Mesopotamia. So in conclusion, it looks like Katesh, or the goddess that is often identified as Katesh, is our prime contender for the Burney relief. Not what I was expecting a few years ago. Well, if you liked this video, you may like some of my other videos. If you didn't like the video, tell me what you would prefer to see. Go ahead and leave me a thumbs down if you hated it. I read all of the comments eventually. I'll read yours. So feel free to leave a comment. Anyway, catch you later. Bye-bye.